Every year, Canada pushes roughly 600 million young trees into the ground. Not in parks or gardens, but in the scarred places. Land stripped bare by chainsaws, hillsides burned black by wildfire, and entire forests turned the color of rust by an insect about the size of a grain of rice. For decades, crews have walked this broken ground, planting seedlings barely taller than a hand, then leaving them to the weather and the years. What those forests became 3 decades later is a story almost no one expected. To understand what grew back, you first have to understand what was lost. Canada holds one of the largest stretches of forest on Earth. A dark green band of spruce, pine, fir, and birch that wraps across the top of the continent, covering an area so vast that you could lose most of Europe inside it. For thousands of years, this forest renewed itself. Trees grew, died, fell, and fed the seedlings that followed. Fire swept through, and the land grew back greener. It was a system that had balanced itself since the last ice age. And then, in the span of a single human lifetime, that balance began to break. The first great wound came from something almost too small to see: the mountain pine beetle. It is a native insect, no longer than a grain of rice, and for most of history, it lived quietly in the forests of Western Canada. Cold winters kept it in check. A few weeks of deep freeze each year, down to around 40 degrees below zero, would kill most of the beetles in the wood and hold their numbers down. The forest and the beetle had an agreement, written in frost. But as the winters slowly warmed, that agreement fell apart. The killing cold came less often, and the beetle, suddenly free, began to multiply. What followed was, in the words of many scientists, the largest insect outbreak in North America's recorded history. Beginning in the 1990s and stretching past 2015, the mountain pine beetle tore through the pine forests of British Columbia and beyond. Each beetle bored through the bark of a tree and laid its eggs in the living tissue beneath. The larvae ate that tissue, cutting off the tree's ability to move water and food. And then they spread to the next tree, and the next, and the next. By the time the outbreak began to fade, it had killed pine across more than 18 million hectares. To picture that, imagine a forest the size of the entire country of Greece, standing dead. And it did not just die, it changed color. A pine killed by beetles does not fall right away. First, its needles turn a deep, rusty red, so that whole mountainsides appeared to be on fire without a single flame. Then, over the following years, the red faded to a ghostly gray, and the forest became a graveyard of bare, silver trunks standing shoulder to shoulder for as far as the eye could see. People who flew over British Columbia in those years described the same thing. Mile after mile of red and gray where there should have been green. It was one of the largest die-offs of trees ever witnessed. The damage went deeper than the view. A living forest pulls carbon out of the air and locks it away in wood and soil. It is one of the planet's great lungs. But a dying forest does the opposite. As all those billions of dead trees began to rot, they released their stored carbon back into the sky. For a period, the forests of British Columbia stopped being a place that absorbed carbon and became a place that gave it off. The lung had begun to breathe the wrong way, and the beetle was only one wound. As the climate warmed and the summers grew longer and drier, wildfire seasons turned ferocious. Fires that once burned tens of thousands of hectares began swallowing hundreds of thousands and then millions in a single summer. Forests that took a century to grow could be reduced to black sticks and ash in a single afternoon. On top of all of this lay the older scars, the clear cuts, the wide bare patches where industrial logging had stripped the land and moved on, leaving behind soil that no longer remembered how to be a forest. Stand in the middle of one of these dead landscapes and the first thing you notice is the silence. No wind in leaves because there are no leaves. No birdsong because there is nothing left to feed the birds. Just gray trunks and the small, dry sound of dead wood. For a long time, it was easy to look at that and believe the forest was simply gone, and that nothing could bring it back. But people refused to accept that, and what they did next became one of the largest, longest, and quietest restoration efforts on the planet. Canada decided it would replant. Not a token gesture, not a single ceremonial forest, but an industrial-scale operation that has continued year after year for decades. Across the country, the forest sector plants on the order of 600 million seedlings every single year. 600 million. That is not a one-time event. That is the steady rhythm of a nation that has made replanting a permanent part of how it treats its land. Much of it is required by law. When a forest is cut or burned or killed, the work of bringing it back begins. In British Columbia, the province hit hardest by the beetle, a special program was created in 2005 with a single purpose: to reforest the land the beetle and the fires had destroyed. Crews surveyed millions of hectares of dead and dying forest, deciding where the land could heal on its own and where it needed help. Where it needed help, they planted. Tens of millions of seedlings went into beetle, killed and burned ground in that province alone, year after year, a slow green answer to an enormous loss. And it is worth understanding exactly how those trees got into the ground, because it is one of the hardest jobs in the country. Canadian tree planting is done largely by hand, by people who carry heavy bags of seedlings on their hips and walk across rough, burned, uneven ground for 10 hours a day. A strong planter can put well over 1,000 trees into the soil in a single day, bending down, cutting a slot in the earth, slipping in a seedling, closing the soil, and taking the next step again and again and again, thousands of times. They work through heat, rain, black flies, and exhaustion, often camping in remote bush for weeks at a stretch. Each one of those 600 million trees represents a single human being bending down one more time. It is, quietly, one of the great acts of physical labor in the modern world, and almost no one outside the forest ever sees it. But planting a tree is not the same as growing a forest, and this is where the people doing the work learned some hard lessons. In the early days, the temptation was to plant fast and plant simple. Row after row of a single species, all the same age, packed close together. It looked like a forest. But a forest is not just trees. A wall of identical pine is fragile. It can be wiped out by a single pest, a single disease, a single fire, the same way the original pine forests fell to a single beetle. So over time, the science changed. The new rule became deceptively simple. The right tree in the right place. Plant a mix of native species suited to that exact patch of land. Match the seedling to the soil, the slope, the climate that is coming, not just the climate that was. Build a forest with variety in it, because variety is what lets a forest survive the next surprise. In 2021, this quiet, decades-long effort suddenly had a famous new chapter. Canada announced a bold national promise to plant 2 billion additional trees over 10 years as part of the fight against climate change. It captured headlines, it captured imaginations. By the middle of 2025, more than 228 million of those trees were in the ground, alongside agreements to plant hundreds of millions more, many of them on land scarred by wildfire and led by indigenous communities restoring their own territories. And then, that same year, came an honest and difficult turn. In its 2025 budget, the federal government scaled the promise back. The 2 billion target was lowered, and the program was set to wind down after delivering closer to 1 billion trees rather than 2. For many people who care about forests, it was a real disappointment, a reminder that political will can rise and fall with budgets and elections. But here is the thing that is easy to miss in that headline. The deeper story of Canada's forests never depended on a single program. Long before that 2 billion tree pledge was ever announced, the country was already planting hundreds of millions of trees every year. And long after the pledge changes shape, that steady work continues. The forests do not read budgets, they simply grow. And what those older plantings, the ones put in the ground 20 and 30 years ago, have quietly become is the part of this story that genuinely surprised even the scientists. Because something remarkable happens when you give a planted forest time. The first surprise was simply how fully the green returned. Walk onto a hillside that was planted 30 years ago, a slope that was once grey snags or black ash, and you do not find a thin plantation. You find a forest. Trees taller than a house, a closed canopy overhead, shade on the ground and moss, and the soft give of fallen needles underfoot. In the places where crews planted a thoughtful mix of native trees and then let nature take over, the land did far more than survive. It rebuilt itself into something that looks and feels and functions like a wild forest again. The recovery, in the right places, was not slow and grudging. It was generous. The second surprise was hidden in the air, and it took careful science to measure. Researchers studying regrowing forests around the world made a striking discovery about timing. A young forest does not capture carbon at a steady, gentle pace. It accelerates. As the trees move out of their fragile early years and into vigorous youth, their hunger for carbon climbs. And many regrowing forests reach their fastest rate of carbon capture at around 30 years of age. 30 years. Which means the forests Canada planted a generation ago are, right now, in this decade, hitting their stride. The seedlings that crews pushed into dead ground in the 1990s are now in their most powerful years, pulling carbon out of the sky faster than they ever have before. The lung that had been breathing the wrong way is, in these places, breathing in deeply once again. And the scale of what that could mean is enormous. Researchers in Canada recently modeled what would happen if the country planted trees strategically along the northern edge of its Great Boreal Forest. They combined satellite data, fire patterns, and climate projections, and their conclusion was stunning. Planting a carefully chosen 6.5 million hectares could pull down close to 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide over the next 75 years. That alone is more than 5 times everything Canada emits in a single year. And if the effort was scaled up to the most suitable land available, the number could climb several times higher still. The trees, given decades, are not a small gesture against climate change. They are potentially one of the most powerful tools the country has. But the third surprise may be the most moving of all. Because a forest is never only about carbon, it is about life. And as those planted forests matured, the life came back. When scientists looked closely at where Canada's best restoration opportunities lay, they found something hopeful. Many of the places where trees grow back fastest and strongest are the very same places that are home to species in trouble, animals and birds clinging on in a shrinking world. Restore the forest, and you do not just store carbon. You rebuild a home. A 30-year-old forest is no longer a row of saplings. It has layers. It has tall trees and young ones, dead wood and living, dense thickets and open glades. And that structure is exactly what wildlife needs. Birds return to nest in the canopy. Small mammals move into the underbrush. Insects, fungi, and the countless invisible threads of an ecosystem reweave themselves through the soil. The silence that once defined these dead places fills, slowly, with sound again. A forest that was planted one seedling at a time becomes, 3 decades on, a living, breathing community that no one planted at all. The animals simply arrived, because at last there was somewhere worth arriving to. So picture it one more time. Stand on a hillside in Western Canada that, 30 years ago, was a field of grey and rust-colored death. A place so silent and bare that you might have believed nothing would ever grow there again. Stand on that same hillside today. Above you is a canopy of green. Around you is the smell of resin and damp earth. Somewhere nearby, a bird is calling, and the wind is moving through living needles for the first time in a generation. The forest that was lost did not stay lost. It was carried back, one seedling at a time, on the backs of people whose names you will never know, and then it did the rest itself. That is the quiet truth at the heart of this story. Human attention wavers. Programs are launched and scaled back. Promises are made and revised. Headlines come and go. But a tree planted in good soil does not wait for any of that. It simply grows year after year, indifferent to politics, until the day it becomes shelter and shade and home. Canada set out to replace what it had lost, and in the trying, it learned something larger: that a dead forest is not always an ending. Sometimes, with enough patience and enough hands and enough years, it is only the longest possible beginning.